We have an excellent turnout today. I'm very grateful to be able to welcome back Ambassador William B. Taylor for today's session on after, whatever that might mean in this circumstance, after Russia's war on Ukraine. As many of you will recall, Bill was with us 4 months ago, 4 long months ago, on this topic for a discussion that might well have been entitled Before Russia's War on Ukraine. And in that session, Bill made a couple of predictions. One was that President Putin would, in fact, decide to proceed to military action against Ukraine. And secondly, without reserve, he said the Ukrainian people would resist energetically. He was right on both calls. And I thought we would all benefit from hearing from Bill on his take 4 months into this, where we're headed, and how this will all shake out in terms of the future European security order. For those who were not able to attend the first session, let me just briefly say that Ambassador Taylor is Vice President for Russia and Europe at the U.S. Institute of Peace. He has served as the chargé d'affaires at the embassy in Kyiv and previously as ambassador to Ukraine. He's had many other important diplomatic assignments at a very senior level, directly involved in the diplomatic response to the Arab Spring, a tenure in the Iraqi Reconstruction Management Office, a stint in Kabul, Afghanistan. He's a graduate of West Point and of Harvard University's Kennedy School of Government, and served as an infantry platoon leader and combat company commander in the U.S. Army in Vietnam and Germany. A diverse and interesting background. Bill, thanks so much for making the time to join us. I know you're in very high demand, but we're very interested to hear about your thinking on this. Thanks so much. Over to you.
Thank you, Brad, for inviting me back. I don't know, it's an honor to be invited back, and I really appreciate it. And I apologize for this WebEx is giving me a hard time here. I don't know if it's discriminating against me or if it's a general discrimination. But in any case, I'm very glad to be here. And yeah, Brad, I remember very well our conversation of 4 months ago. And right after that conversation, I got on a plane, flew to Kyiv, met a bunch of people. This is right at the end of January of this year, right after talking with you. Sat down with many people, friends of mine that I've known, new people, but also a person I'd met a lot of times while I was in Kyiv in 2019, that is President Zelensky. We had General Hodges and I, Ben Hodges and I, had a good hour and a quarter with President Zelensky, and we had this conversation similar, Brad, to the one that I had with you all and with this group, or a lot of this group, a couple of days prior. And we talked about the arrayed Russians on 3 borders of Ukraine, and we talked to President Zelensky about what he was doing about this, how he was preparing his people. And one of the things he was doing was calming them, was ensuring that they didn't panic, and they didn't panic. As you said, they were ready to resist, and he was preparing them to resist, but he's also preparing them for whatever would come. We had a very good conversation, including how he was increasing the size of his military and how he was about to double the pay. The next day, he announced that he was going to double the pay for the combat troops that were arrayed against the Russians on his borders. So, yeah, you mentioned that I made some predictions. I also I evaluated the costs and benefits to Putin about an invasion, and I was impressed at the costs that he would bear, costs that he would incur if he were to to invade, which, as we know, he did. And he's bearing those costs. Let's be clear. He has his soldiers, his army, the Russian army, has probably lost. Estimates range from like 15,000 to the Ukrainian estimates of like 28,000 Russian soldiers. Clearly, there's something in the 15 to 20,000 range that is a reasonable estimate of how many Russian soldiers have died in Ukraine over the past 3 months. In context, people on this call will remember that the Soviets lost about 15,000 Soviet troops in Afghanistan over 10 years. And so now they've lost very likely more than that in 3 months in Ukraine. Because you're exactly right, Brad. I predicted, as many did, that the Ukrainians would fight fiercely. And they know what they're fighting for, and that has motivated them in ways that the Russians can only envy. The Russians are paying the price, as I said. Putin is paying this price, first in terms of Russian soldiers, second in terms of his economy. The sanctions that, again, we looked at, you and I talked about the sanctions that were likely to come. The harshest sanctions that the West has imposed on any nation are now imposed on Russia, including the financial nuclear sanction, which is central bank reserves. And we can talk about this, Brad. I'm looking forward to the questions. So I will go through this quickly, but hoping that people, if they're interested, will come back with questions on that. So the Russian economy is paying a big price, and not just the Russian economy, but Russian people are paying a big price. Strategically, a blunder. Look at what Putin has done to NATO. It is unified. He has unified NATO in a way that we could only imagine. The existing NATO nations have rallied unanimously, which they have to do, of course. It being NATO, it has to be consensus, and the forces that are both deploying to the eastern part of NATO, as well as the military forces, the weapons, the ammunition, the other equipment that the Ukrainians need, coming from NATO allies, is pouring in. Finally, it's pouring in those weapons and that ammunition pouring into Ukraine to enable them to continue the fight. And they will continue. The Ukrainians will continue the fight because of that. Another part of the strategic blunder on the part of Putin is NATO's about to be expanded and strengthened. Finland and Sweden are going to make a major contribution to European security, NATO security, their own security, our security by joining. This is to the detriment of what Putin was after. He thought NATO would not cohere. He thought Europe would not cohere. He thought the international community, led by the United States, would not cohere, would disintegrate, would fracture. And NATO hasn't, Europe hasn't, the international community aligned, arrayed against Russia has not. The international community arrayed in support of Ukraine has maintained it. It's tough. It's going to be tough. We're paying a price, and everybody knows that the cost of oil and gas goes up. Inflation is up. Food prices are up. The Russian boycott, the Russian quarantine, the Russian blockade of Ukrainian ports is bottling up the wheat that would otherwise be flowing to international markets. We know this is painful, and it continues. The solidarity continues. So that's in some real sense, Brad. We can go into more details about this. So the question for us, kind of you hinted at this. Where do we go? How does this end? No one knows. I don't know. One thing I believe, and I will say with confidence, is that the Ukrainians will prevail. I'm going to sketch out two scenarios for discussion here. But in either case, in either scenario, whether it's a short scenario or it's a longer scenario, the Ukrainians in the end prevail in some way. And we'll talk a little bit about that. And then I do want to get to kind of after they prevail. The Ukrainians, by the way, don't say after the war, they say after the victory. So after the victory, what will Europe look like? And how will we ensure that we don't face this kind of aggression from the Russians again? So how does this end? Short and long. The short version, this is the optimistic version, I will grant you, is that what we've seen from the Russian military, in particular the ground forces, continues. We will, in this scenario, see the Russian ground forces fail. Like they failed when they tried to go in the first phase of the war, they tried to go to Kyiv, got blocked. The Ukrainian military stopped them, pushed them back into Russia and Belarus. They tried again in Kharkiv. And the Ukrainian military has pushed them back away from Kharkiv. The Ukrainian military has fought them to a standstill around Donbass. Yes, the Russian military has been able to establish a so-called land bridge from Donbass that they've occupied since 2014 to Crimea, which they've occupied since 2014. And they are trying to hold that. Ukrainians are resisting, even under occupation, the Ukrainians are resisting. But in this first scenario, the Ukrainian military, supported by the continued weapons and fuel and equipment from NATO, in particular the United States, but in this first scenario, that support continues, even accelerates, and the Russians continue to do badly on the ground. And the Russian military that's been in the field now since late last year and has gotten whipped in several fields, in several cities, in several attempts, offensives, and they are being thrown into the battle again, and they crumble. They fold in this first scenario, and the Ukrainians push them back out, maybe as far as the front lines on the 24th of February of this year when the Russians invaded again, maybe further. But in this first scenario, the Russian military, already fragile, suffers a catastrophic failure, continues to a catastrophic failure. That's the first scenario, in which case the Ukrainians establish themselves, continue on about their integration into Europe, join the EU. We're going to talk about this in the third part of this discussion. But they continue to develop their country as a free nation, free sovereign nation. Longer scenario, second scenario, is longer, and that is the one that we're kind of seeing right now. That is stalemate around Donbass, and the Russians will mobilize in this scenario because their real constraint right now is soldiers. They are running out of soldiers. And I mentioned this is part of the first scenario where the soldiers that they now have are beaten up. 20,000 are dead. And they have a hard time. They're having a hard time replacing them. But in this second scenario, they mobilize. They call up the reserves. It takes a while for these reserves to be retrained and put into the fight. But the Russians in this scenario continue to do that, and they hold some part of Ukraine in the same way that I just described. That is Donbass to the land bridge down to Crimea, and they hold that, and that's kind of a stalemate. Think of North Korea, South Korea. There's a truce. There's no peace. There's no negotiated end to that. It's a truce. And in this scenario, it's a long one, and it continues to extract a price in the Ukraine scenario on both sides. There's no negotiation. There's no treaty. There's no agreement. Maybe there's a ceasefire, maybe there's the truce, but there is continued occupation. The Russians continue to occupy a swath, that same swath, that land bridge that I just mentioned. In this case, Free Ukraine, which is the part of Ukraine that is not occupied, and again, it's the majority of Ukraine, but it's been damaged. There's no doubt that the bombardment, one part of the Russian military that has actually performed has been the air attack, the air bombardment, the cruise missiles, the ballistic missiles, the long-range artillery, indiscriminate, some focused on fuel and transportation nodes, but some hitting civilian targets across the country. But the Free Ukraine in this longer scenario, the Free Ukraine establishes itself, and it's not able to take back the swath of land that I mentioned, as in the first scenario, but it lives with it. It's a truce. Again, it's the kind of North Korea, South Korea. The other model that we can throw out there to think about is West Germany, East Germany. So during the Cold War, the Soviets controlled anyway, the eastern part of Germany, East Germany, and West Germany developed into the European Union. Obviously, joined NATO. So it's possible to think through that kind of scenario in this longer one that it still allows the Ukrainians, Free Ukraine, to develop economically, politically. They're constrained, and they need support, and they need rebuilding, they need reconstruction support. But that can happen. So those two, Brad, those two scenarios, and again, I'd love to talk further, and I'm sure there are a lot of people on this call who have thought about this and would like to, give me other suggestions, other options, and other attributions of those scenarios that might be relevant. Let me do one last thing before giving it to you, Brad, and open it up for questions, and that is, okay, after the victory, in either case, Russia, unless Putin is out, which is actually a possibility, in particular in that first scenario, if there's a catastrophic failure of the Russian military, President Putin's probably in trouble. But if he's still in, or if someone like him is still in the Kremlin, then the Kremlin and the Russian leadership will bide its time, regroup, rearm, and be able to attack again, be able to renew its attempt to dominate Ukraine. They'll come back. They'll be back. We know this from, and again, there are Russian historians on this call who will know this better than I. But when you look at Russian history, not just under Putin, not just under Russia, not just under the Soviet, not just under the Tsars, you go back through Russian history, and what you see is autocratic rule. And what you see is aggressive rule. And what you see is expansionist Russia. And that's pretty consistent. And we will continue to see that. So how to ensure Ukrainian security and East European security in this after the victory period that we're talking about here? Let's say the East European, Central European security, because NATO, after the victory, will be stronger. It'll be confident. It'll be united. It will probably be bigger by a lot, including the Finns and the Swedes. The United States will be confident, that it was able to rally not just NATO, but the European, the West. So the United States, the rest of NATO will be in a stronger position. But the question, and Russia will be isolated. Let's skip over it. So Russia will be isolated, at least from the Western financial system, will be excluded. Putin, if he's still in office, will be a pariah. No one will meet with him. We know that President Biden has. We know what he thinks. Biden thinks of Putin in terms of a killer and a thug and a war criminal and even genocidal. It's hard to imagine anyone, certainly any American president, sitting down. Certainly not Joe Biden, sitting down with President Putin. So Russia in this after the victory scenario is economically damaged, constrained. The controls, the export controls on technology, in particular, the electronic components and chips that it needs to manufacture washing machines as well as tanks, are constrained, are boycotted, are banned. The export ban from us to them stays in effect. Many of the sanctions stay into effect. Maybe all of the sanctions stay in effect. So Russia is constrained, hobbled, economically damaged, and isolated. So so after the victory, what does Europe look like? Well, it's got a strong NATO, it's got a weak Russia, and the question is, what is in the middle? The countries like Ukraine, countries like, I don't know, Moldova, some of the other nations. There are some Balkan countries that are still interested in their security. So what is that? And then the question comes. So that question then leads to collective security. And there are two ways. Just looking at Ukraine, there are two ways that Ukraine might ask for a security guarantee from the United States and other NATO nations. One is they, essentially renewing their application, Ukrainian application to join NATO, or renewing the application to the United States and Britain and Poland, or for some kind of an Article 5 type, NATO Article 5 type security guarantee. There is that. In other words, a commitment. The Ukrainians, of course, would like to have a legally binding commitment. They know about non-legally binding. They know about political commitments because when they gave up their nuclear weapons in the mid-90s, they got an assurance, a political commitment from the United States and Britain and Russia that their sovereignty and territorial integrity would be respected, that they would be secure. And of course, that didn't work. So political guarantees are not what they're after. They're looking for legally binding. And so in Article 5, kind of, whether in NATO or whether in parallel to NATO, but then there's a second version, Brad. There's a second way that the Ukrainians can be supported and secure themselves, and that is for there to be a ironclad commitment from the United States and from other NATO nations to arm Ukraine so that they can deter a further invasion from Russia. And there are a lot of ways to do that. There are a lot of ways to make a commitment from the United States to Ukraine, to its security, by providing weapons, like we're doing now. That's part of what we are doing now, is providing serious weapons. And this, after the victory scenario on providing security for Ukraine, could be in the form of the weapons would be more sophisticated, would be NATO compatible, would be longer term, and this commitment to provide weapons, NATO compatible, state of the art weapons, whether they be aircraft or armored vehicles, to enable Ukraine to deter Russia's attack again, a potential Russia attack again. That commitment could be in the form of an MOU. And the Israelis and the United States and Israel have a series of MOUs that commits us that under these MOUs, which we abide by, we provide the Israelis with military equipment, with weapons, state of the art, a competitive edge over other militaries in the neighborhood, in Israel's neighborhood. That could be done for Ukraine as well. Brad, let me stop there and go to you for questions, or for questions from your audience there. And I would love to love to hear the critiques. I'm sure there will be some. I look forward to it.
Bill, that was terrific. Thank you.